June 7, 1944. Just after sunrise, inside a requisitioned chateau outside Tours, General Erich von Falkenheim stood motionless over a vast operations map. Tiny steel pins glinted in the morning light, each one representing a division he believed could still decide the war in the West. To Falkenheim, the pattern was elegant. Deadly. Panzer Division Adler, rolling north from Poitiers. The 9th SS Armored, advancing from Rouen. Other mechanized units threading their way through the French countryside, converging like clenched fingers around a single point. Normandy. The Allied landings were barely a day old. Their troops were still crowded on the beaches, their supply lines fragile, their positions untested. Falkenheim believed, fiercely, that a single, concentrated armored strike could shatter the invasion before it hardened. If his tanks reached the coast by nightfall on June 8, the sea itself might swallow the enemy. He had prepared for this moment for nearly 3 years. As commander of Armored Group West, Falkenheim controlled the largest mobile reserve Germany still possessed in France. His doctrine was simple, hammered into him over decades of war: speed, mass, shock. Strike before the enemy organizes. Break him before he can breathe. On paper, everything was working. Panzer Adler reported steady movement. The SS column was closing on its jump-off points. The hammer was rising. What Falkenheim did not yet understand was that his army was already being destroyed. Not on the beaches. Not by enemy tanks. But mile by mile. On the roads of France. The first reports arrived mid-morning. Routine, his staff thought. An air attack on a fuel convoy near Locks. A delay south of Le Mans, the road cratered overnight. A unit forced to disperse after low-flying aircraft strafed the column. Normal friction. Acceptable losses. But then the tone changed. A battalion commander reported that his fuel trucks were burning in a wheat field, their black smoke visible for miles. His tank sat silent, engines dead, crews waiting beside machines that could no longer move. Minutes later, another message. Signals vehicles destroyed on an exposed stretch of highway. Radios smashed. Command nets gone quiet. By noon, Falkenheim no longer listened to individual reports. He listened to the rhythm. And the rhythm told him something was terribly wrong. The roads, every road his panzers depended on, had become killing zones. And the enemy doing the killing was nowhere to be seen. 5 Panther tanks never reached the front. They were caught on a narrow bend of road before noon, engines cold, crews exposed. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes. When it was over, the steel hulks smoldered quietly in the hedgerows, abandoned before a single Allied soldier ever saw them. Near Avranches, a medical convoy was hit next. White-painted ambulances scattered along the roadside, torn open by cannon fire. Stretchers lay overturned in the ditches. Men who had survived artillery and shrapnel bled out beneath the open sky. Inside the chateau at Tours, the operations officer forced himself to focus on the larger picture. Pins were moved. Notes were added. Yes, losses were mounting. Yes, the timetable was slipping. But on paper, the counterstroke still existed. General von Falkenheim said nothing. He had fought wars where aircraft were an irritation, not a sentence of death. He remembered columns advancing in daylight while friendly fighters circled overhead, the air as secure as the ground beneath their tracks. That world was gone. By early afternoon, a pattern emerged, one his staff struggled to explain. These were not chance encounters. Not lucky sightings. Every major route north was being watched. Every column that dared move by day was detected, tracked, and attacked with unnerving speed. The enemy did not stumble upon German units. They waited for them. Something fundamental had changed in the nature of war, and Falkenheim was watching his doctrine collapse in real time. What he could not see from his headquarters was the vast mechanism now hanging over France. By the summer of 1944, the Allies had created an air force unlike anything the world had known. American and British squadrons operated as a single, coordinated organism. Thousands of aircraft, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, flowed across the sky in overlapping waves. But the true innovation was not numbers. It was integration. For the destruction of movement itself, the Allies relied on a new breed of aircraft, the fighter-bomber. The American P-47 Thunderhawk was built like a battering ram with wings. Heavily armored, brutally powerful, it could dive at extreme speed, release bombs or rockets, then climb away while ground fire stitched harmlessly below. Pilots trusted it the way infantry trusted cover. The British answer was the Tempest, fast and lethal, carrying rockets capable of ripping through vehicles, supply trucks, and even tanks caught from the right angle. Its pilots practiced endlessly, refining the dive, the release point, the escape, until destruction became routine. Yet the aircraft were only the visible edge of the blade. Months before the landings, Allied planners had begun dismantling France's transportation system piece by piece. Rail yards vanished under bombing raids. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Junctions were smashed, repaired, then smashed again. By the time the invasion began, German divisions no longer had choices. They were forced onto predictable roads. Into narrow corridors. Into open daylight. And above those roads, Allied aircraft were already circling. Waiting. For the invasion itself, the Allies unleashed something von Falkenheim had never encountered in 4 decades of soldiering, a battlefield that could think, react, and strike in real time. This was not air support as he understood it. It was coordination. Along the Norman coast, mobile control units, some hidden in orchards, others mounted on trucks just behind the beaches, tracked aircraft moving through the sky. Ground controllers spoke directly to fighter-bomber pilots, steering them toward targets identified minutes earlier by reconnaissance aircraft or observers on the ground. At Army headquarters, liaison officers no longer waited hours or days for air cover. They requested strikes and watched aircraft appear overhead almost immediately. The sky had become part of the command structure. Radio networks tied everything together. Common procedures eliminated confusion. Information moved faster than any German staff officer could imagine. The result was not chaos, but precision. It functioned like a living system. A German column began rolling north. Within minutes, it was spotted. The sighting was transmitted. Aircraft were redirected. The response was automatic. Fighter bombers dropped from altitude in screaming dives, unleashed rockets or bombs, then vanished just as quickly. Before flak crews could react, another formation arrived. Then another. There was no rhythm to learn. No pause to exploit. Survivors later said it felt less like combat and more like being stalked. Movement itself became dangerous. Roads offered no protection. Distance meant nothing. The front line no longer mattered. The sky was watching, always. On June 7 alone, American squadrons flew thousands of ground attack missions, hammering every approach route leading toward the beaches. British aircraft added wave after wave, maintaining pressure from first light until dusk. Every major road within reach of Normandy was patrolled relentlessly. Von Falkenheim's armored reserve was not marching to battle. It was walking into a closing vice. By mid-afternoon, denial was no longer possible. Reports pouring into headquarters painted a picture of systematic destruction. Panzer Division Adler, the formation intended to lead the counterstroke, was being shredded south of Cannes-sur-Orne. Its commander radioed in short, urgent bursts. His columns were under constant attack. Vehicles burned faster than they could be replaced. Ammunition trucks detonated in chain reactions. Infantry scattered into hedgerows and ditches, waiting for engines overhead to fade, only for them to return minutes later. Even the generals were no longer safe. That morning, the division commander's staff car had been caught on an exposed road near Argenton-les-Bois. Fighter bombers swept in without warning. The windshield exploded. The road vanished under gunfire. He survived by diving into a drainage ditch, pressing himself into the mud as bullets tore the ground apart above him. For the first time, a German Panzer commander understood the truth. This was not a delay. This was annihilation, executed from the air. When the commander finally crawled out of the ditch, his hands were trembling so badly he could barely stand. His staff car was engulfed in flames. 2 officers who had been sitting beside him were dead before they ever understood what had hit them. The man chosen to drive the counteroffensive had just spent an hour pressed into mud, hiding like a foot soldier. The tanks themselves were not the primary victims. A Panther could shrug off machine gun fire. Even bombs often had to land close to do real damage. But armor alone was useless without what followed behind it. Fuel. Ammunition. Infantry. Artillery. Radios. Spare parts. And those were precisely the elements being erased. In his private notes, written later in captivity, the division commander recorded the truth without euphemism. During a single day of movement, his formation lost dozens of vehicles to air attack. Most were transport trucks and supply carriers, soft targets, yes, but indispensable ones. Among the wreckage lay several tanks destroyed before they ever encountered an enemy soldier. The division was not defeated in battle. It was dismantled in transit. Elsewhere, the situation was no better. The 9th SS Armored Division, advancing from the east, ran straight into the same invisible wall. In the clear afternoon light, their columns stretched along exposed roads, easy to find, impossible to hide. Rocket-armed British aircraft descended with surgical precision. Even veterans hardened by years of fighting found themselves powerless. There was nothing to fire at. No position to counterattack. The enemy appeared from above, struck, and disappeared. Back at headquarters, von Falkenheim's staff fought a losing battle of their own. Columns were diverted onto minor roads. Movement was restricted to early morning and dusk. Urgent requests were sent to higher command, pleading for fighter cover. The answers never came. The German Air Force, exhausted and outmatched, simply did not exist in meaningful strength over France. Fighters that attempted to intervene were overwhelmed almost immediately. On that day, German aircraft appeared in the sky only sporadically. Allied planes filled it continuously. By nightfall, von Falkenheim faced a reality no war college had prepared him for. On the situation map, everything still appeared intact. Arrows pointed north. Divisions remained labeled. The plan still existed. But behind those symbols was chaos, burning convoys, scattered units, shattered communications. The counterattack would not happen tomorrow. Perhaps not the next day. Perhaps not at all. The realization came late in the evening. Von Falkenheim stood alone before the map table. The staff had withdrawn to their stations, buried in reports, voices low, movements mechanical. The headquarters hummed with radios and teleprinters. The map showed a future that no longer existed. Armor converging. Strength massing. A decisive blow forming. In reality, the armored fist had already been broken. Without ever striking the enemy. Von Falkenheim did not need optimism. He had numbers. All day, he had read the reports others tried to soften, lost tables, fuel tallies, logistic summaries, messages stripped of hope by exhaustion. He understood what the clean arrows on the map concealed. One of his elite divisions had lost nearly a third of its transport strength in a single day of movement. The vehicles that survived carried only fumes in their tanks. Replacement convoys vanished almost as soon as they formed. Another armored division had reached the outskirts of Cannes, but not as a formation. Its battalions were scattered across villages and hedgerows, radios unreliable, fuel measured in hours rather than days. The rest of his forces were still far away, trapped behind shattered rail lines, forced onto damaged roads, inching forward through a landscape already claimed by enemy aircraft. The decisive blow he had imagined no longer existed. His divisions would arrive eventually. But they would arrive separately. Late. Under strength. Short of everything that made armor decisive. They would not strike as a fist. They would be fed into the fighting like patches, not weapons. Meanwhile, across the channel, the enemy's strength was compounding by the hour. More infantry. More tanks. More artillery. The beachhead was growing heavier, deeper, harder. By the time German armor could gather for a coordinated assault, there would be nothing left to break. Von Falkenheim had devoted his life to understanding armored warfare. He knew the equations of mass and momentum, the timing of exploitation, the fragile balance between speed and supply. But he had never prepared for an enemy who could see everything. Never fought a war where movement itself triggered destruction. Where roads were battlefields. Where the march to contact was the fight. That evening, standing alone in the dim light of headquarters, he understood the truth. The war he had trained for no longer existed. Tank battles. Breakthroughs. Operational maneuver. The clash of steel against steel, those belonged to another era. This was a war of systems. Of networks. Of information and control. And in that kind of war, whoever ruled the sky ruled the ground. Germany had lost it long before the first armored column turned toward Normandy. Von Falkenheim continued issuing orders. He redirected units. He allocated what little fuel remained. He did his duty, because duty was all he had left. But sometime in the quiet hours of June 7, the belief was gone. The mathematics no longer allowed victory. In the days that followed, his divisions reached the front at last. They fought bravely, skillfully, and at terrible cost. One armored formation engaged British forces near Tilly-sur-Orge. Others were thrown piecemeal into the widening battle. They did not fail for lack of courage. They arrived too late. To a war that had already changed. Near Cannes, the armored troops fought with everything they had left. The SS division earned a grim reputation for discipline and resilience. In isolated clashes, German tank crews outmaneuvered their opponents, scoring local victories that proved skill and experience still mattered. Many of those men had survived years of brutal combat in the East. They knew how to fight. But wars are not decided by moments. By June 9, more than 300,000 Allied soldiers were already on French soil. 3 days later, that number had grown far beyond what German planners had believed possible. Tanks, guns, fuel, ammunition, entire armies flowed ashore without interruption. What might have been a fragile foothold on the morning of June 7 had hardened into a fortress before the week was over. The counteroffensive that von Falkenheim once imagined never materialized. His armored divisions were no longer instruments of decision. They became fire brigades, rushed from one crisis to the next, always reacting, never shaping events. Then, on June 10, the war reached him personally. Allied intelligence, drawing from aerial reconnaissance, intercepted transmissions, and resistance networks, identified the location of his headquarters near a quiet Norman village. Shortly before evening, aircraft appeared overhead. The strike was brief and devastating. Bombs and rockets tore through the compound. Staff officers were killed where they worked. Radios fell silent. Maps burned. The nerve center of Germany's armored command in the west ceased to function in a matter of minutes. Von Falkenheim was badly wounded as he tried to reach cover, metal fragments ripping through his body. He survived, but his command did not. Panzer Group West was finished as an operational headquarters. Control fragmented. Decisions slowed. Coordination vanished. The general was evacuated and soon removed from command. Years later, writing in defeat, he did not blame his subordinates. He did not argue that better timing or bolder movement could have saved the situation. Instead, he wrote of misunderstanding. The decisive struggle, he concluded, had not been fought on the beaches or in the hedgerows. It had been fought on the roads, long before German armor ever reached the front. There, under relentless observation, Germany's last chance to concentrate force had been erased. The fighting in Normandy continued for months. German units resisted fiercely, contesting every field, every village, every crossing. They inflicted losses. They slowed the advance. They fought with professionalism and courage. But they were fighting backward. The initiative had been lost in the first days and would never be recovered. When historians ask what truly decided the fate of D-Day, the answer may not lie only in the blood-soaked sand of the beaches, but in the wrecked convoys scattered across France. In the pilots who never saw the men they killed. In the controllers, technicians, and planners who built a system that made concentration impossible. In 1940, German armor had raced across France beneath contested skies, protected by its own aircraft, free to maneuver. In 1944, that same doctrine was attempted under absolute enemy air dominance. The difference was fatal. The roads that once carried victory had become corridors of destruction. Mass had turned into vulnerability. Courage was not enough. Systems defeated bravery. Information defeated speed. Control of the air decided everything. And the general who watched his armored reserve die without ever striking the decisive blow learned a lesson that would shape modern warfare forever. Whoever controls the sky, controls the war beneath it. Thank you for watching. If this story added something new to your understanding of World War II, consider liking the video and subscribing. This channel exists to explore the overlooked moments and deeper truths that history deserves to remember.